Dr. Elena Vasquez had been reviewing surgical oncology consults for 11 years when the chart arrived on my desk with a name I hadn't spoken aloud in a decade. Margaret Vasquez. Female. 63 years old. Referred by a community physician at Trentwood Family Practice for evaluation of a suspicious mass in the right breast, 2.4 centimeters, irregular margins, confirmed on ultrasound. The referral note said the patient had delayed the specialist appointment by 4 months because she didn't believe the first mammogram was accurate. I was chief of surgical oncology at Aldermore University Medical Center. I had 47 surgeons, fellows, and residents under my department's umbrella. I had personally performed or supervised over 2,000 oncologic resections. I had published 31 peer-reviewed papers on margin-negative resection outcomes in aggressive breast malignancies. I was also, according to the intake form, Margaret Vasquez's daughter. I recognized her social security number before I recognized her handwriting on the patient history form. She had listed her emergency contact as my brother, Raymond Vasquez, and his wife, Cynthia. She had not listed me. Under the section that asked whether any family members had a history of medical or surgical careers, she had written, "None known." I set the chart down. I picked it up again. The tumor was aggressive. The pathology from the core biopsy our radiology team had already processed told me everything I needed to know before I walked into that examination room. Grade 3 invasive ductal carcinoma. Her estrogen receptor status was negative. Her HER2 status was positive. Without surgical intervention and a coordinated treatment plan, the 5-year survival curve was not forgiving. I was the most qualified person in a 4-state radius to save her life. She had spent 30 years telling everyone who would listen that I was delusional. Hello, everyone. If you have ever had someone look at you, someone who was supposed to love you, and tell you that your dreams were embarrassing, that your ambitions were a sign of something broken in you rather than something powerful, I want to hear your story. Leave a comment below. Tell me what they said, and tell me what you did with it. Because what I'm about to tell you took me 20 years to live and about 30 minutes to understand completely. But to understand why that morning meant what it did, I have to take you back. 30 years back. I was 20 years old and sitting at the kitchen table of the house my parents owned on Mercer Street in Clayfield, Ohio when my mother first said it out loud. Not the way people say something once and forget it. The way people say something they have been waiting years to finally give permission to. I had been accepted to the pre-medical program at Hargrove State University. Not my first choice. My first choice had been Aldermore University itself, which had a direct-track undergraduate to medical pipeline that I had been researching since I was 16, but Hargrove was legitimate, it was accredited, and I had earned a partial academic scholarship that covered 40% of the first year's tuition. I needed help with the rest. I needed $18,400 for the first year's costs after the scholarship was applied. I had asked my parents to consider using a portion of the college fund my grandmother, Dolores Vasquez, had set up before she died. My grandmother had loved me. She had told me, the last summer before her stroke, that I was going to be a doctor and that she would make sure I had what I needed. The college fund contained, at the time I asked, approximately $34,000. Half of it was, by the terms of my grandmother's informal arrangement with my father, intended for me. My mother looked at the acceptance letter I had placed on the table. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "Elena, who told you that you were smart enough to be a doctor?" My father, Hector Vasquez, was at the counter. He didn't turn around. I said that I believed I was capable of completing the coursework. I said that I had a 3.91 GPA. I said that I had already spoken to the pre-med advisor at Hargrove, a woman named Dr. Patricia Osei, who had told me I was an excellent candidate. My mother said, "Doctor Patricia Osei doesn't have to live with your failure, we do." My brother Raymond was 17. He was sitting across from me eating cereal. He laughed, not cruelly exactly, more the way you laugh when someone older and more powerful than you has already defined the rules of the room, and laughing is the safest way to align yourself with them. My mother continued. She said that medicine was not for people like us, that our family didn't produce doctors, it produced workers. That there was dignity in working, and that I was embarrassing myself and embarrassing her by pretending I was something I wasn't. She said the word delusional. She said it clearly, and she did not soften it. She said they would not be contributing the college fund money to what she called this scheme. She said if I wanted to go to nursing school, they would discuss it. But that medical school, the idea of me as a physician, was not something she was willing to fund or support, or from the way she said it, even acknowledge as a real possibility for someone like me. My father finally turned around. He said, "Your mother's right, you should think about something practical." I did not argue. I had learned already, by 20, that arguing in that house produced nothing except longer arguments and the same outcome. I looked at the acceptance letter. I looked at my mother's face, which was not angry exactly. It was something more like satisfied, the way a person looks when they have said a thing they have wanted to say for a long time. I folded the letter. I put it in the back pocket of my jeans. I went to my bedroom and I wrote down the name of the direct track program at Aldermore University on a piece of paper, the one I hadn't been accepted to yet, the one I hadn't even applied to yet, the one that would require me to transfer, to reapply, to find my own money, to build an entirely different route. I folded that piece of paper and I put it in my wallet. I kept it there for 6 years. I enrolled at Hargrove State on a combination of loans, a second part-time scholarship I applied for without telling my family, and money I had saved from 18 months of working weekend shifts at a medical transcription service in downtown Clayfield. The transcription work was where I first learned to read pathology reports. The irony of that did not occur to me until much later. The first year at Hargrove was harder than I had expected, and not in the academic ways I had prepared for. I was working 22 hours a week at the transcription service while carrying a full course load. My organic chemistry professor, Dr. James Whitfield, a compact and exacting man who had a habit of standing absolutely still when a student answered incorrectly, told me in October of my first year that my examination scores suggested I was either undertesting or underpreparing, and that if I was serious about medical school, I needed to decide what I was doing with my time. I told him about the transcription work. I didn't tell him about my family. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Cut your hours by half. I'll write you a letter for the Hargrove Science Excellence Fund. It won't cover everything, but it'll cover something." The letter got me $2,200. It was not enough to quit the transcription work entirely, but it let me cut my shifts. My grades in the second semester of organic chemistry were the highest in the section. My family didn't know any of this was happening. My mother called once a month, on Sunday evenings. She asked whether I had come to my senses yet. When I told her my grades, she said, "Grades don't mean you'll get into medical school, Alina." When I told her I had gotten a recommendation from Dr. Whitfield, she said, "One professor's opinion." Raymond called occasionally and talked about his own plans. He was going to work in my father's tile business, which was a reasonable and honest thing to do, but he didn't ask about mine, and I didn't offer. In the spring of my second year at Hargrove, I applied to transfer to Aldermore University's pre-medical program. I did not tell my family. The application required 3 letters of recommendation, a personal statement, and a $95 application fee that I paid in cash. I was rejected. The letter was 2 sentences. It thanked me for my interest and informed me that the program was highly competitive and that my application had not been selected for the current cycle. I sat with that letter for 2 days. I want to be honest about those 2 days, because the story I am telling you is not the story of a person who never fell. It is the story of a person who fell in private and got up before anyone could see her on the ground. Those 2 days were the closest I came, in that entire early period, to believing my mother was right. Not because I thought she was right about my capabilities, but because I was exhausted, and I was 22, and I was doing all of this entirely alone, and there is a specific kind of doubt that comes not from failure itself, but from failing when no one who loves you is watching. Dr. Patricia Osa, the pre-med advisor who had told me I was an excellent candidate, back at the beginning, had moved from Hargrove to a faculty position at Aldermore the previous fall. I didn't know this until I looked her up to ask for advice about reapplying. I emailed her. She responded within 4 hours. She said, "I was wondering if you'd reach out, reapply next cycle. I'll make sure your file gets a real read." The second application, submitted 13 months later, included a research position I had taken in Hargrove's Basic Sciences Lab, a second letter from Dr. Ose herself, and a personal statement that I rewrote 11 times. The $95 application fee came out of my tax return. I was accepted. I called no one. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the apartment building where I lived. a two-floor building on Grantham Avenue that smelled permanently of a neighbor's cooking, and I read the acceptance email on my phone 3 times. Then I started the car, and I drove to the grocery store because I needed eggs, and I was out of coffee. And there were 2 exams the following week, and my life was continuing regardless of the fact that something I had wanted since I was 16 had just happened. My mother called that Sunday as usual. She asked if I had thought about nursing school. I said I was doing well with my current coursework. She told me that Raymond had gotten a promotion at the tile business. I told her I was glad for him. We hung up. I had every intention of keeping it that way. The Aldermore pre-medical program placed its transfer students in a cohort that moved through the curriculum in a specific sequence, and it was in the second semester of that cohort program that I met Dr. Simona Dami, who was then a third-year surgical oncology resident, and who was doing a rotation through the undergraduate research lab as part of a teaching fellowship. She was from Lagos by way of London. She was 30 years old. She had a laugh that cleared an entire room, and she was the first person I had ever met who had the exact specialization I had circled in the Aldermore program guide and underlined twice: surgical oncology. I had not told anyone outside of formal application processes that surgical oncology was what I was aiming at. I had told advisors because advisors needed to know. But I had learned, by that point, to be quiet about my specific ambitions. Ambitions stated out loud became targets. I had watched my mother take a stated ambition and use it as evidence of delusion. I was not interested in offering anyone else the same ammunition. Dr. Adami did not require me to state my ambitions. She saw them in how I worked. She supervised my lab rotation for 1 semester, and then, at the end of that semester, she asked whether I had considered applying for the Aldermore Surgical Research Scholars Program, which was a competitive year-long placement that embedded pre-medical students in active surgical oncology research. She said she was not technically supposed to make direct recommendations, but that she was going to anyway because she had reviewed every student in the cohort, and I was wasting time doing anything else. The application required a faculty endorsement. She provided it. I was placed in the lab of Dr. Kwame Asante, a surgical oncologist who had trained at Memorial Sloan Kettering and who had returned to Aldermore specifically to build a research program in margin analysis for breast malignancy resection. His work was technical and meticulous, and he explained nothing twice. He expected residents and scholars and students alike to read before they asked questions. I read everything on his published list before my first day. He noticed. On my third day in the lab, he handed me a set of slides from a research case, de-identified pathology specimens, and asked me what I saw. I described the margins. I described the tissue architecture. I used the correct terminology because I had spent 2 weeks reading specifically so that I could use the correct terminology. He said, "You've read Hicks and Lester." I said I had read Hicks and Lester, Schnitt and Collins, and 3 of his own published papers. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Come back tomorrow at 7, we have a fresh set." That was the beginning. Not the beginning of my career. The official beginning came later, after medical school, after residency, after fellowship. But the beginning of the specific expertise that would, 15 years later, land on a desk in front of me in the form of my mother's pathology report, and require every precise thing I had learned since that first morning in Dr. Asante's lab. My mother called that Sunday as she always did. She asked whether I was still doing that school thing. I said I was. She said Raymond was thinking about buying a house and asked whether I had any thoughts on the real estate market in Clayfield. I said I didn't follow it closely. She said I should think about getting something practical sorted out before it was too late. I thanked her for the advice. I told her I had to go. I had a set of slides to review for 7 o'clock in the morning, and I needed to read 2 more papers before I slept. Medical school at Aldermore was 4 years of the most demanding sustained attention I have ever given to anything, and I gave it completely, without reservation, without complaint, and without ever once mentioning to my family that I had been accepted or that I was attending. My mother's Sunday calls continued through all 4 years. She spoke of Raymond's house purchase, his wife Cynthia, their first child, my father's tile business, the neighbors on Mercer Street, the church they attended. She asked occasionally whether I had found a steady job. I said I was working in research. She said research didn't pay. She was not wrong about that. I graduated from Aldermore University School of Medicine on May 14th, a Thursday, at a ceremony in the Aldermore Main Auditorium, and the only people who knew this was happening were Dr. Adami, by then a fellow herself, on her way to her attending position, and Dr. Asant, who attended the ceremony because 3 of his scholars were graduating and he considered their graduation a professional obligation. He shook my hand afterward and said, "General surgery residency, then oncology fellowship. Don't let anyone put you somewhere smaller." I did not go home for graduation. I had no reason to. My general surgery residency was at Miriam Hadley Hospital in Hartford, Connecticut, a Level I trauma center with a surgical oncology program that accepted 2 fellows per year and had a national ranking in cancer surgery outcomes. I matched there on March 15th, which in medicine is called match day, which is the day you find out where the next 5 years of your life will be spent. I was in the residency office when the envelope was opened. A fellow resident named Tobias Brennan, who was from a large family in Boston and who had the instinctive warmth of someone raised to celebrate other people's wins, read the result over my shoulder and said, "Hartford. That's a serious program, Vasquez. That's a real program." I thanked him. I called no one else. The residency was 5 years, and they were the years that built the technical foundation of everything that followed. 12-hour calls that became 24-hour calls. The first time I closed a resection independently, and the attending, a surgical oncologist named Dr. Rachel Kimura, said nothing afterward, which meant the closure had been correct. Dr. Kimura only spoke when something needed correcting. The first time I reviewed a set of pathology slides with the clinical team and identified a margin concern that had been missed on initial read, and which, when re-examined, proved to be a significant finding. The morning that Dr. Kimura told me, in the hallway outside the surgical suite at 6:45 in the morning, that she was recommending me for the Miriam Hadley Surgical Oncology Fellowship without reservation. That evening, I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage on the 3rd level, in a space I had parked in almost every day for 5 years, and I held my phone for a long time. I thought about calling my mother. I thought about it for a long time. What I would say. What she would say. Whether there was a version of that conversation that ended with something other than what every conversation with her had already ended with. Her assessment of my choices as evidence of instability, of delusion, of someone reaching for something they were not built to hold. I put my phone back in my pocket. I drove home. I ate the dinner I had packed that morning because there hadn't been time for the cafeteria. I set my alarm for 5:15. She had no idea what I had become. None of them did. And I had every intention of keeping it that way. The fellowship was 2 years, and in the 2nd year of the fellowship, on a morning in February when the Hartford streets were carrying 4 inches of overnight snow, and the hospital was running on its emergency staffing skeleton, I performed a procedure that made it into the department's annual case review as a teaching example. I won't describe it in surgical detail here. This is not a story about a procedure. But I will say that it was a case involving a 44-year-old woman with a locally advanced breast malignancy and a set of imaging results that had been read by 2 prior teams as inoperable, and that the outcome of the procedure was a margin-negative resection with negative sentinel nodes, and that the patient was alive and disease-free when I left Miriam Hadley 3 years later. Dr. Kimura presented the case at the National Society of Surgical Oncology conference that following spring. She credited my work by name. It was the first time my name appeared in a National Surgical Oncology forum. I was not in the room for the presentation. I was in Hartford, covering calls. At the close of the fellowship, I received 3 recruitment offers. The one I accepted was from Aldermore University Medical Center, the institution where I had transferred as a terrified 23-year-old, with a piece of paper in my wallet and a family at home who thought I was delusional. They were recruiting for a new attending position in their surgical oncology division, and Dr. Asant, who was by then the division director, had put my name forward personally. I signed the contract on April 3rd. I moved back to the same city where I had started, but I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in the Northfield district with a view of the Aldermore campus and a monthly rent that I paid from a salary my mother would not have believed was real. I did not tell her. At Aldermore, I built my clinical practice and my research program simultaneously, which most people in the department advised against. My colleague and closest professional ally in those early attending years was Dr. Marcus Webb, a thoracic oncologist who had been at Aldermore for 7 years by the time I arrived, who knew the institutional politics the way a sailor knows a harbor he grew up in, and who became the first person in my professional life to know the full shape of my story. I told him one evening after a department meeting that ran long, when we were the last two people in the conference room and he had asked, with the directness that was simply how he operated, why I never mentioned my family when other attendings talked about theirs. I told him everything. The kitchen table, the $18,400, the word delusional, the piece of paper in my wallet. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do they know you're here?" I said they did not. He said, "Are you going to tell them?" I said I didn't know yet. He nodded, as if that was a complete and reasonable answer, which was exactly why I trusted him. In my 4th year as an attending, Dr. Asant moved into a university administrative role and the division directorship opened. I applied. There were 3 other candidates, all of them more senior in years of service, one of them a surgeon with a national profile in pancreatic oncology who had been courted from a program in Houston. The search committee deliberated for 6 weeks. On November 9th, a Tuesday, mid-morning between a surgical consult and a faculty research meeting, I received a call from the Dean of Clinical Affairs at Aldermore, a measured and precise administrator named Dr. Helena Forthright, who had a habit of beginning calls with a professional pleasantry and then arriving at her point with no additional ceremony. She said, "Dr. Vasquez, I'm pleased to offer you the position of Chief of Surgical Oncology." I thanked her. I confirmed the start date and the terms. I told her I was honored and that I intended to build something meaningful in the role. We hung up. I walked to the window of my office, a real office, with my name on the door in a brushed steel nameplate, on the 6th floor of the Aldermore Oncology Pavilion, with a view of the campus and the city beyond it, and I stood there for a moment that I am not going to try to make smaller than it was. I was 40 years old. I had gotten here from a kitchen table on Mercer Street in Clayfield, Ohio, from $18,400 that was denied to me, from a word my mother had used with satisfaction and precision. I had gotten here through Dr. Osai's email reply, and Dr. Whitfield's letter, and Dr. Adami's endorsement, and Dr. Asant's 7 o'clock mornings, and Dr. Kimura's silence when a closure was correct. I had gotten here through 20 years of work done entirely outside my family's field of vision. I picked up my phone. I stood at the window for a long time with it in my hand. I put it back down. That same year, a matter came across my desk that had nothing to do with medicine directly, but that required me, for the first time, to engage someone in the legal world on my own behalf. The university's conflict of interest review process had flagged a potential issue with a research grant I had accepted from a foundation with peripheral ties to a pharmaceutical company, and while the review ultimately cleared me completely, I had been advised to retain independent counsel during the process. A colleague referred me to an attorney named Jonathan Ape, a partner at Meridian Counsel, LLP in the city, who specialized in medical professional liability and institutional contracts. He was thorough, calm, and efficient, and the review process resolved in my favor within 6 weeks with a formal letter of clearance from the university. The legal fees came to $7,400, which I paid from my own accounts without concern, which was itself a form of evidence of how far I had traveled from the woman who had needed to count dollars in a parking lot to cover a $95 application fee. Jonathan and I remained in professional contact after the matter closed. He had, in the course of the review, seen enough of my professional history to understand the scope of what I had built. He said once, after the clearance letter arrived, that in his experience the people who built careers under that kind of pressure produced work that was almost impossible to challenge. I thanked him. I did not tell him about my mother. The department under my leadership grew. Within 3 years of my appointment as chief, we had added 2 fellowship positions, launched a multi-institutional research collaboration on neoadjuvant therapy protocols, and published outcomes data that placed our program in the top 7% of university-affiliated surgical oncology departments nationally. My medical records review process, the systematic way I ensured that every chart in my department received a complete and documented clinical assessment, became a departmental standard that the university's quality office eventually adopted institution-wide. I mention this because it matters later. The fact that I had built a department where no referral chart went unreviewed by a senior physician, where the standard was complete attention to every case that crossed our threshold. It was this standard that meant, on a Tuesday morning in October, when a referral from Trentwood Family Practice arrived in our departmental intake queue for a 63-year-old woman with a 2.4 centimeter breast mass with irregular margins confirmed on ultrasound, the chart was not triaged to a fellow. It came to me. It came to me because the intake coordinator, a meticulous and experienced woman named Gloria Chen, had flagged it as a high-priority referral based on the imaging characteristics, and high-priority referrals came to the chief first. Gloria had no way of knowing what was in that chart beyond the clinical data. I had it on my desk before 9 o'clock in the morning. I had come that close to everything surfacing before it was time. Twice in the preceding year, I had almost called. Once after a holiday that passed quietly in my apartment with Marcus and his family, when the warmth of that gathering made my own silence feel very large. Once after a case involving a patient whose family had traveled hours to be present for a difficult conversation, and the sight of them gathered in the hallway had produced something in me that I was careful not to examine too closely. But I had not called, because the time had not yet been right. Because the conversation, when it came, needed to happen on ground I had chosen, not ground I had stumbled onto. I looked at the intake form. I looked at the line where it said emergency contact, Raymond Vasquez. I looked at the line where it said family members in medical careers, none known, and I understood with a clarity that was almost physical in its precision that the ground had now been chosen for me. The phone on my desk rang at 10:47 that morning. The display read the main number for the Trentwood Family Practice. I knew before I answered that it was not going to be the referring physician. I picked up the receiver. It was Raymond. I knew it would be Raymond before he said a word, because Raymond had always been the one the family sent when they needed something done without the appearance of asking for it directly. He had a way of presenting requests as announcements, of framing favors as logistics, of making the person being asked feel that refusal would be a confusion rather than a choice. He said, "Elena, hey, Mom's at your hospital." I said I was aware. There was a pause. I could hear the particular quality of his silence, the slight recalibration that happened when Raymond encountered something that wasn't going the way he had constructed it in his mind. He said, "We got a letter. They said her case was assigned to the chief of surgical oncology." I said that was correct. Another pause. Longer, he said, "I didn't know you were, Dad said you were working in research or something." I said I had been doing a number of things over the years. He said, "Okay, well. Listen. We were hoping, Cynthia and I and Dad, we were hoping we could come in and meet with whoever is running Mom's case. To talk about options. You know how Mom is, she doesn't always hear things clearly the first time." I said I would arrange a family consultation. He said, "Great, yeah, and Alina, it would probably be easier if you weren't in the room for that. You know, it might confuse things, for Mom." I said I understood. I set the receiver back in its cradle, and I sat with my hands flat on my desk for a moment, and I looked at the window, at the Aldermore campus in the October light, at the nameplate on my door visible in the reflection of the glass, and I understood, with a completeness that required no emotional processing, what the next several weeks were going to involve. Raymond had just asked the chief of surgical oncology to remove herself from her own patient's case because her presence might be confusing. He had done this without knowing he was talking to the chief of surgical oncology. He had done this because 30 years of evidence had told him I was the kind of person who could be managed by that particular kind of request. I called Marcus Webb that evening. I told him what had happened. He listened to all of it, and then he said, in the measured tone he reserved for situations that were in fact quite serious, "You need to call Jonathan." I called Jonathan Ape at Meridian Counsel, LLP, at 8:45 that evening. He answered on the second ring, which was one of the things about Jonathan that I had come to rely on. I told him the situation. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Are you her attending physician of record?" I said that her chart had come to me through departmental intake and that I had not yet formally accepted the case or recused from it. He said, "Don't do either until we speak tomorrow morning." I signed the first document the following morning before rounds. There was no going back. The document Jonathan had prepared was a conflict of interest disclosure, not because I was conflicted in any clinical sense, but because the situation warranted formal documentation of the relationship between physician and patient for the protection of all parties, including my mother. Jonathan had drafted it overnight, which I mention because it is an example of what professional competence actually looks like when you have chosen the right people to have in your corner. The disclosure named my relationship to the patient, confirmed my clinical qualifications, and established that a second review of the case by an independent attending would accompany any treatment planning decisions I made. I brought the disclosure to Dr. Helena Forthright, the Dean of Clinical Affairs, at 7:15 in the morning before her calendar filled. She read it in full. She looked up and said, "You're her daughter." I said yes. She said, "And the family has not identified you as a physician." I said that to the best of my knowledge, the family was under the impression that I worked in research. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, with the particular precision that had made her effective in that role for a decade, "The disclosure is appropriate and thorough. I'll co-sign it this morning. You retain clinical authority unless you choose to transfer it." I thanked her and walked back to my department. Marcus was waiting outside my office. He was holding 2 coffees, which meant he had come prepared for a real conversation and not a hallway exchange. We went inside and I closed the door. He said, "How'd it go with Helena?" I said it had gone well. I told him about the co-signed disclosure. He said, "And the family consultation Raymond requested?" I said I had scheduled it for Thursday of the following week. I had not yet informed Raymond of who would be conducting it. Marcus said, "When were you planning to inform him?" I said, "Thursday." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Vasquez." I said, "I know." He said, "Are you sure you want to be in that room?" I said, "I've been the most qualified person in every room I've ever walked into where this family was concerned. The only difference Thursday is that they'll know it." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Okay, what do you need from me?" I told him I needed him present as a departmental witness. I told him I would be having Jonathan review the patient's insurance policy and coverage documentation before the meeting. Because in my experience, families facing an aggressive cancer diagnosis frequently had incomplete understanding of what their health insurance coverage actually provided, and I wanted to have a clear and complete picture of my mother's coverage before any treatment planning conversation began. I told him I also needed the complete medical records from my mother's primary care physician at Trentwood Family Practice, which the referral process had not yet transferred in full. Marcus said, "You've already requested the records." It was not a question. I said, "Gloria requested them yesterday, standard intake protocol." He said, "And the insurance review." I said Jonathan had a contact at the insurance carrier who could facilitate a full policy review within 48 hours given the urgency of the clinical situation. Marcus set down his coffee. He looked at the window the same way I had looked at it the previous morning. Then he said, "They have no idea." I said, "No." He said, "Is that the point?" I thought about that for a moment because it was the right question and it deserved an honest answer. I said, "The point is that my mother has a grade 3, HER2 positive invasive ductal carcinoma, and she delayed her specialist appointment by 4 months because she didn't trust the imaging, and someone in this building needs to be completely prepared to give her the best possible chance. The rest of it, the family, the history, all of it, that's secondary. But yes, I want them to understand what they're walking into. I want them to understand what they dismissed." Marcus nodded. His coffee. He said, "Thursday." I said, "Thursday." The following Tuesday, I was reviewing charts in my office at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon when Cynthia called my cell phone. Raymond's wife Cynthia, who had been part of the family for 17 years and who had always maintained a careful and pleasant neutrality in the specific question of my existence, called the cell number she had found through Raymond's contacts and said, "Elena, hi. I hope it's okay that I'm calling this number." I said it was fine. She said, "Ray mentioned you were going to be at the hospital on Thursday for Margaret's thing." I said I would be there. She said, "It's just we were wondering if you could give us a sense of what to expect from the doctors so we can prepare." I said, "The consulting physician will go through the complete pathology findings and outline the recommended treatment approach. You'll have time to ask questions." She said, "And it won't be like bad news." I mean, is she going to be okay? I said. "The physician will have a complete picture of the case and will be able to address that directly." She said, "Okay, good, that's reassuring. You always did have a sensible way about you, Elena." She said it warmly, the way you say something that you mean as a compliment, and that is, in its own way, a capsule of exactly the problem. I thanked her. I told her I would see them Thursday. I set the phone down on my desk and looked at the wall across from me, where my board certifications were framed. The American Board of Surgery. The American Board of Surgery Subspecialty Certification in Surgical Oncology. The Aldermore University Faculty Appointment Documentation. The citation from the Society of Surgical Oncology for the work Dr. Kimura had presented at the national conference 9 years earlier. That was the moment I understood exactly how much they had underestimated me. The night before the Thursday consultation, I sat in my living room and I called a patient. Not my mother, a different patient, a woman named Adiz Okonkwo, 51 years old, who had come through my program 2 years earlier with a presentation not unlike my mother's. HER2 positive, aggressive, caught at a stage where the outcome depended entirely on how quickly and precisely the surgical and oncologic teams moved. Adiz had done well. She was in remission. She called me on the anniversary of her surgery each year to say thank you, and I had begun, over time, to look forward to those calls more than I had expected to when they started. I called her because I needed to remember why the work mattered beyond what was about to happen in that consultation room. She answered, and I told her I was thinking about her and asking how she was doing. She told me she had been to her daughter's school recital that evening. She said her daughter had played the violin badly, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. I told her I was glad. I went to sleep. The family consultation was scheduled for 10 o'clock on Thursday morning in the third-floor oncology conference room at Aldermore's Clinical Pavilion. The room had a long oval table, 12 chairs, a whiteboard, and a wall-mounted display screen that connected to the department's imaging system. It was the room where I held departmental grand rounds, where I met with interdisciplinary teams to review complex cases, where I had sat across from families who were frightened and exhausted and needed someone to tell them the truth clearly. Gloria Chen had arranged the logistics. She had sent a formal appointment confirmation to Raymond's email address, the one listed on the intake forms, stating that the consultation would be conducted by the Department of Surgical Oncology and that the patient's assigned physician would be present. It did not name me specifically. This was not accidental. Raymond arrived first at 9:52. I know this because Gloria tracked arrivals for all consultations and noted them in the administrative log. He was followed by Cynthia at 9:54 and my father, Hector Vasquez, at 9:58. My mother arrived in a wheelchair at 10 o'clock exactly, brought up from the imaging suite where she had been receiving her morning scans. She was smaller than I remembered. Her hair was entirely gray now, cut short. She was wearing a blue cardigan over a hospital gown, and she had her purse on her lap, which was such a specific and familiar thing. She had always kept her purse on her lap in any situation where she felt uncertain, that it required me to take exactly one measured breath before I entered the room. Marcus was already inside, standing near the display screen, reviewing the imaging files. Present also were Dr. Priya Nair, the medical oncologist from our interdisciplinary team who would be co-leading the treatment planning, and Sandra Ortega, the department's patient care coordinator, who documented all family consultations in writing. Gloria Chen was outside the door, handling administrative logistics. I entered the room at 10:02. Raymond looked up. He was mid-sentence in something he was saying to Cynthia. His sentence stopped. My father turned from the window. Cynthia's expression did the specific thing that happens when a person's face has to rapidly revise itself, not a flinch exactly, but a reorganization. My mother looked up from her purse. I said, "Good morning. I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez, Chief of Surgical Oncology at Aldermore University Medical Center. I'm the attending physician on this case. Thank you all for coming." The room was completely silent. I walked to the head of the table and set down the folder I was carrying, the one that contained my mother's complete medical records, the pathology report, the imaging review summary, the insurance policy documentation that Jonathan's contact had provided, and the conflict of interest disclosure co-signed by Dean Forthright. I pulled out the chair and sat down. Raymond said, "Elena," I said, "Dr. Vasquez, in this context, I want to keep things clear for the record." He said, He stopped. He tried again. "You're the chief of surgery," I said. "Surgical oncology, specifically. I've been chief of this department for 4 years. I've been on faculty at Aldermore for 7. Prior to that, I completed my surgical oncology fellowship at Miriam Hadley Hospital in Hartford and my general surgery residency at the same institution. I'm board certified in surgery and in surgical oncology, and my specific area of clinical expertise is the management of aggressive breast malignancies. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, I am also Margaret Vasquez's daughter. This relationship has been formally disclosed to the Dean of Clinical Affairs per institutional protocol, and an independent review mechanism has been established for any treatment planning decisions made on this case. The documentation is in front of you. I slid a copy of the disclosure to the center of the table. No one touched it. My mother was looking at me. She had not spoken, her hands were on her purse, and she was very still. My father said quietly, Elena, I said, Dad, a pause. I'll come back to the personal side of this. Right now, I need to give your wife the clinical information she needs, because her case is time-sensitive and the conversation we're having today will shape the next 3 months of her treatment. Is everyone ready to proceed? Raymond said. Shouldn't someone else be doing this? Isn't there a conflict? I said. The conflict of interest disclosure you are looking at was reviewed and co-signed by the Dean of Clinical Affairs. It is the standard institutional mechanism for exactly this situation. I am the most qualified physician in this department to manage this specific presentation. The independent review mechanism ensures that no decision I make goes unchecked. Do you have further questions about the process, or would you like to proceed to the clinical information? That was the first document. I had 3 more. Raymond looked at Cynthia. Cynthia looked at the disclosure on the table. She picked it up and began reading it in the careful way that people read documents when they are trying to find something wrong with them. I opened the folder and I began. I walked the family through the pathology report in complete and specific language. Grade 3 invasive ductal carcinoma. Tumor dimensions. Margin characteristics on the core biopsy. Estrogen receptor status, negative. Progesterone receptor status, negative. HER2 status, positive, confirmed by immunohistochemistry and FISH analysis. I put the imaging on the screen, the mammogram, the ultrasound, the MRI that had been completed the previous week, and I explained what each image showed and what it meant. I did not soften the language. My mother sat across the table and listened. She asked no questions. Her hands stayed on her purse. When I finished the pathology summary, Raymond said, So what does that mean, in plain terms? I said, It means the tumor is aggressive and hormone receptor negative, which limits certain treatment options. It also means it is HER2 positive, which is clinically significant because there are targeted therapies designed specifically for this subtype that have substantially improved outcomes over the past decade. In plain terms, this is a serious diagnosis. It requires prompt intervention, and with the correct treatment sequence, the 5-year survival outcomes for this subtype are meaningfully better than they were 15 years ago. Cynthia said, So she'll be okay, I said. I don't make outcome promises. What I can tell you is that the treatment plan we are recommending gives your mother-in-law the best available evidence-based pathway to a good outcome. And I can tell you that pathway begins in the next 2 weeks, which is why I want to be very clear about what her health insurance coverage provides for the treatment sequence we're recommending. I slid the second document to the center of the table. It was the insurance policy review, a summary prepared by Jonathan's contact at the carrier, cross-referenced against the specific treatments in the proposed plan. Neoadjuvant chemotherapy with the HER2 targeted agent. Surgical resection. Adjuvant radiation. Post-surgical targeted therapy for 12 months. The coverage determination for each line of treatment, the copay structure, the out-of-pocket maximum. Raymond picked it up this time. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said, Jonathan Ake prepared this. I said that Meridian Counsel LLP had assisted with the insurance review on my request. Raymond said, You have an attorney. I said, I have several professional relationships that I maintain for institutional and personal matters. Jonathan has worked with me for several years. I watched Raymond absorb that. The image he had carried of me, the delusional younger sister who had needed to be managed, who worked in research, who was a practical and minor figure in the background of the family's actual life. I could see that image encountering the documents on the table and finding no purchase. His voice, when he spoke next, was slightly different. Not softer exactly, more careful. Elena, Dr. Vasquez, how long have you been here? At Aldermore, I said. 7 years on faculty, 4 years as department chief. He said, and before that, Hartford, I said. 7 years in Hartford, residency and fellowship. He did the arithmetic. I watched him do it. He said, you were doing this when Mom, he stopped. I said, When Mom called me delusional at my 30th birthday dinner in front of the family. Yes. I had been in medical school for 2 years at that point. I had been building toward this for 6 years by then. The room was very quiet. My father put his hand over his face. Not dramatically, the gesture of a person who has understood something that they would have preferred not to understand. My mother said, for the first time since I had entered the room, "You never told us." I said, "No," she said. "Why?" I said. "Because I knew what you would say." And I had made a decision, a long time before that birthday dinner, that what you would say was not going to be the thing that determined what I did. I slid the third document to the center of the table. It was a copy of my curriculum vitae. Not because I needed them to see my publications or my committee appointments, but because it was the factual record of what had been built, quietly and entirely, while the family had continued to operate under the assumption that I was a person who required correction and management. 31 peer-reviewed publications, 3 national awards, the Society of Surgical Oncology citation, the faculty appointment, the departmental leadership record. Cynthia looked at it and then looked at me and then looked at it again. My mother's hands had gone still on her purse. Raymond said, very quietly, "Mom always told people you were in research." I said, "I know." He said, she didn't know." I said, "She didn't ask, and I didn't tell her." There was a silence that lasted long enough to become its own kind of statement. Then Raymond said, in a voice that had lost all its management and logistics and pleasant orchestration, "Why are you here, on her case? You could have transferred it." I said, "Yes." He said, "But you didn't." I said, "No." He said, "Why?" I looked across the table at my mother. She was looking at me with an expression that I had not seen on her face before, not in all the years of Sunday phone calls, not in the years before that, not on the evening of my 30th birthday dinner, when she had used the word delusional in a room full of people who accepted it without question. The expression was something I can only describe as recognition. Not of me as her daughter, which she had always known, but of me as a person who had been fully real all along, in ways she had chosen not to see. I said, "Because she has a HER2 positive grade 3 invasive ductal carcinoma with a 2.4 centimeter primary mass, and I am the most qualified surgical oncologist available to her within a 4-state radius. And whatever happened between us, whatever the last 30 years were, that fact does not change." I slid the fourth document to the center of the table. It was the proposed treatment plan. Detailed, specific, every stage named, every timeline defined, every specialist appointment scheduled in sequence. 12 weeks of neoadjuvant chemotherapy with the targeted HER2 therapy to begin within 2 weeks. Surgical resection at week 14, to be performed by me, contingent on the independent review confirming my approach. Adjuvant radiation beginning at week 18. Post-surgical targeted therapy continuing for 12 months, covered under the insurance policy per the review Jonathan's contact had completed. Dr. Priya Nair, who had been professionally patient and silent through the entire proceeding exchange, leaned forward and said, "Mrs. Vasquez, I'm Dr. Nair. I'll be co-leading your care alongside Dr. Vasquez. We would like to begin your first infusion appointment next Wednesday if you're in agreement. We'll have a nurse navigator assigned to you by end of day to coordinate everything." My mother looked at Dr. Nair. Then she looked at the treatment plan on the table. Then she looked at me. Said, "You would do my surgery yourself," I said, "if you agree to it and if the independent review confirms the plan, yes." She said, "After everything." I said, "After everything." The room held that for a moment. Then my mother said, "Okay." It was not an apology. I want to be clear about that. The word "okay" in that moment was not 30 years of dismissal being undone in a single syllable. People do not work that way, and stories that suggest otherwise are not true stories. What my mother said in that moment was an agreement to accept the best available medical care from the most qualified available physician. That was what was real, and it was enough to proceed on. The consultation closed at 11:47. Dr. Nair and Sandra Ortega stayed to finalize the scheduling logistics with the family. Marcus caught my eye as I stood and gave me the specific nod that meant he would debrief with me afterward, and that for now everything had gone correctly. Raymond stopped me at the door. He put his hand on the doorframe in the way people do when they are not sure they should be stopping someone but are going to anyway. He said, "Elena." I turned. He said, "I'm sorry, I didn't know." I looked at him for a moment. He was 53 years old, my younger brother, and he looked in that moment genuinely bewildered, not performing bewilderment, but actually encountering a version of events that had been real the entire time and that he was only now being permitted to see. I said, "I know you didn't." I walked out. My mother began her first chemotherapy infusion the following Wednesday at 9 in the morning. I was not in the room for that. Her nurse navigator, a meticulous and warm woman named Danielle Park, managed the infusion suite. I reviewed the monitoring notes that afternoon and confirmed the session had proceeded without complication. The neoadjuvant phase ran 12 weeks. The tumor responded well to the targeted therapy. A reduction in primary tumor dimensions from 2.4 centimeters to 1.1 centimeters confirmed on interval imaging at week 8, which placed her in the favorable response category and strengthened the case for margin-negative resection. I performed the surgery on a Friday morning in January. The procedure lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. My mother was on the table, and I was at the operating field, and every technical decision I made was grounded in the expertise I had spent 20 years acquiring in complete silence, while she spent those same 20 years not knowing where I was or what I was building. The margins were clear. All 4 sentinel lymph nodes were negative. She recovered without complication. She was discharged after 3 days. The independent review of my surgical plan and execution, conducted by a senior surgical oncologist named Dr. Yemi Afolabi from the Branford University Cancer Center, confirmed every decision I had made. His written review, filed with the dean's office, included the phrase exceptional technical proficiency and evidence-based decision-making throughout the case. I kept a copy. My mother completed her adjuvant radiation course in March. She began the 12-month post-surgical targeted therapy in April. At her 6-month imaging review, the scans were clear. We have not become close. I want to be honest about that because the story that ends with every wound healed and every relationship restored is not the story I am living. What we have become is something smaller and more real than that. She calls on Sundays. We talk for 15 to 20 minutes. She asks about my work in a way that is careful, as if she is holding something she is not certain she has the right to hold. I answer in a way that is honest without being designed to wound. She has never said the word delusional again. Not in my presence, not that I am aware of. Raymond and I have dinner twice a year. He asks about the department. I ask about his children. His older daughter is 12 and has told him she wants to be a doctor. He told me this at dinner in August with an expression that was simultaneously proud and something else, something I chose not to name out loud, because I did not need to. My father is 71 and still working in the tile business, and we speak on his birthday and on mine. My professional life continues. The department is in its strongest period since my appointment. Our 5-year outcomes data placed us in the top 4% of university-affiliated surgical oncology programs, nationally in the most recent benchmark cycle. We have 2 new fellowship positions opening next year. I am 3 months into a research collaboration with Dr. Nair and Dr. Afolabi on HER2 positive treatment response prediction modeling that I believe will produce something worth publishing. On the shelf above my desk, the desk where my mother's chart first landed, there is a framed photograph taken on the day I was appointed chief. Marcus Webb took it. It shows me standing outside the door to this office with my hand on the doorframe, looking at the nameplate, not at the camera. I don't remember him taking it. I look, in the photograph, like a person who is not quite believing the thing they are looking at is real. I understand that. It took 20 years to become real. That kind of reality arrives slowly. And if there's anything this experience taught me, it's this. 1. The work you do in silence is not invisible, it is simply being stored, quietly and completely, until the moment arrives when every piece of it is needed at once. 2. Documentation is not bureaucracy, it is the permanent record of what actually happened. And in any room where someone is prepared to rewrite history, the person holding the documented truth holds the room. 3. You are not the person your family decided you were at 20 years old, you are the person you have been building yourself into every day since, and those are not the same person, and only one of them is yours to keep. Was I wrong to never tell my family what I was becoming, to let them operate for 20 years under a version of me that was 30 years out of date? Tell me in the comments. If this story gave you strength, hit that like button. It means more than you know.